the work of design systems exposes all of the conflict. I mean, that is why it's valuable. There's this thing I keep thinking about, which is like product owners not working on the system, but working on product stuff. They're kind of like the gatekeepers to adoption. They're the ones who are setting the priorities for their engineers, for their designers, for their UX teams. They're the ones who are like helping kind of dictate the roadmap of the product. And if they're saying, we don't have time for you to go rebuild the button using the new design system button, right? Like there's buttons already in the product, you know? So it's like some product owner has to make space in the roadmap for you to put a new button in. It's funny because it's like, I think everybody knows what the word design means, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody kind of has an idea of what the word system means. And then it's like you put them together. And so we think we know what a design system is because we know what the two words mean independently.
Typically with templates, it works great and very fast when whatever you want to do matches the template. And the moment you want to go beyond the template, then you run into all sorts of situations where it's like, oops, that is actually very complicated.
That gets them, you know, a good portion of the way very quickly in the early days. But there's always a moment where it's like, it just doesn't feel like their organization. They can't make it do the things they want it to do without some real extreme changes. We spend a lot of time building perfect components, and we don't spend as much time thinking about how those components work together to create an experience.
Hi folks, this is Arseni with the new episode of Product Craft. For this conversation, I'm joined by Ben Callahan, design system consultant and founder of Sparkbox. Ben shares his wealth of knowledge that comes not only from his hands-on experience, but also from the weekly design system session he runs called The Question, where every week he dives deep into a specific question with leading design system practitioners. This episode is packed with real-world wisdom for anyone already working on, considering, or simply curious about design systems. We start with the basics and quickly go deep into the craft. I personally learned a ton and had a chance to clarify some of my own burning questions, which many of you may have as well. Some of the themes we covered include why the value of a design system is not in components, in fact, why creating too many components is a common trap, whether a dedicated systems team is really necessary, how to connect design systems to business outcomes, pros and cons of out-of-the-box systems, expressing unique brand character through a design system, and whether a system limits innovation. Why most organizations fail to implement a design system on their first, second, and even third attempts. Tools and approaches shaping design systems today, and quite more. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comment section, and please share the episode with your network to spread the love. This type of content is rarely prioritized by algorithms, and so every like and share will help. Without further ado, please enjoy. It seems like there is always something new to dive into and discuss and like go down like big rabbit holes. What are some of the top common things that people are trying to figure out about design systems?
Yeah, it's funny, man. We've done 52 episodes of The Question and we haven't done a repeat, you know, like, so there is a lot here. And I think on the surface, when people think about design systems, immediately they start thinking about components, you know, and so they're thinking a button component in Figma and a button component in React or something. And that's a big part of what we do, but there's so much more to it, because what we're really doing when you strip all that stuff away is we're asking everybody to change how they work. You know, we're every product team in your organization is going to have to shift the way they think about design and development and product and prioritization and all of that. And so with that comes all of this other stuff. You know, there's like deep.
Why is that? Why do they need to shift and change the way that they work?
Well, what we're really trying to do is find opportunities for efficiency in our workflows and opportunities for more cohesion in the user experience. And so a lot of times in the organizations that I consult with, they have really good people working on their products. It's just they're working in some form of isolation from each other. And so that isolation, the separation of product teams, creates inefficiency in the workflow. And because, you know, many of these teams don't even know it, but they're all solving the same problems many times over. So that's one inefficiency. With when you shift, like if that's the primary thing you're trying to tackle, when you shift your workflow, all of a sudden now you have to start from a common set of a common basis, a common baseline of experience design that you want to work from. That in some cases is like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube.
Mm-hmm.
These teams that have had so much autonomy to think
Mm-hmm.
and create and design and engineer really cool products, and all they're doing all that well, but that autonomy is really valuable to them. And so when you say we want to take a little bit of that away, just so that as an organization we have some more efficiency and we have a little bit more consistency in the way our customers experience our suite of products,
Mm-hmm.
well, you're just asking them to change. That's a big deal.
Who is typically voicing their concerns about adapting the design system?
Honestly, it really depends on the organization. I would say it's less about the discipline and it's more about the maturity of the
Mm.
individual. When an immature engineer is voicing concerns, it's often because they want to use some new framework or they want to try some new thing, or they just haven't had the experience yet of writing the code for a specific component 20 different times, 20 different ways. When the more experienced engineer sees this, they're like, oh my gosh, thank you. I'm so tired of doing this over and over, or going and digging through GitHub to find the code that I can copy and paste.
Mm.
So like it's a smart way of working. So more mature folks, and I don't mean mature, like just people who have a little bit more experience.
Experienced, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. They tend to really gravitate towards this way of working.
Mm-hmm.
One way of thinking about this is if you have really good people who have been doing this kind of work for years and you just put them on a team and tell them to make products, they're probably going to make really good decisions. And out of that work is going to naturally come systems of working, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
going to recognize, okay, I've already designed this. Let me start a little file where I start to keep track of the common things. That's just a very natural outpouring of mature product work.
Mm-hmm.
What we're trying to do is scale that, and so you can't have these massive organizations can't have 1,000 people that are all really mature. That's just very unlikely.
Yeah.
And so we have to work across a spectrum of experience, a spectrum of expertise, a spectrum of maturity, and systems give us a way to sort of say, hey, let's agree that we're going to work in this way. And that helps a lot for those folks who don't have the same experiences or maybe have a different perspective on how to solve a problem.
What are some of the situations when you may want to allow to not use a design system?
I mean, there's give and take here. My perspective is that I think as an industry, design system practitioners, we've gotten a little bit too our posture's gotten a little too protective.
Mm-hmm.
And I would much rather see a really healthy collaboration between product teams and system teams to say like, hey, let's be really smart about when we choose to use stuff that we know already exists. And when there's a real need for something that doesn't exist, product teams need to go and do that work. I think about this as like a pendulum in some ways, right? There's like these seasons of innovation in organizations, but if all we did was innovate, we wouldn't really have product. It's just
Mm-hmm.
constantly something new. So we also have seasons of standardization, right? And so, I mean, it's kind of like the tip of the spear is the product team out trying to, as much as they can, you build on foundations, but also when they need to innovate, they do that. And then when that innovation is proven and seen to work well for customers and needed in other product spaces, then we could maybe talk about bringing that back into the system, codifying that, making it available to other teams. I think it's tricky, it's like that balance, and it's always an area where there's tension. But I think one thing that you can do to help with that is to stop thinking about adoption of a design system as only the use of components.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We build lots of different layers in systems, right? From very low level stuff that's like brand kind of things, guidelines and principles and all of that, to the next layer up being more like codified design decisions, like tokens. We might say these are the brand colors, let's codify those, give them names. And then beyond that, we might start building, some components or patterns. And so if we think about this scenario where a product team needs to do something that the system doesn't offer, they can still follow those guidelines. They can still use those tokens. They can still follow the sort of design and development patterns of the system. And that
Hmm.
helps a lot when they go at some point in the future to kind of bring things back in if that's deemed necessary.
I think we're going to come back to this, but I'm curious, like to almost like rewind a little bit and start at the foundational level. I was curious to get your take on the definition of what the system is, not even design system, but like what is a system? And then I wanted to get your take on then what is a design system, like just kind of
Yeah,
as
that's
at the very basic level.
yeah. It's funny because it's like I think everybody knows what the word design means, right?
Hmm.
And everybody kind of has an idea of what the word system means. And then it's like you put them together, and so we think we know what a design system is because we know what the two words mean independently. But when you
Hmm.
put them together, they actually mean something much more, I think. um, I think of systems. I don't have like a perfect definition for you on this. There's a lot of great ideas, great writing for generations now on
Hmm.
systems thinking. um, I think a good example of like understanding what systems is is thinking less about the parts, like the components and things that we think of in systems, and more about the connections between them. And that's where I feel like we can get into trouble when you transition that understanding into design system teams, because we spend a lot of time building perfect components, and we don't spend as much time thinking about how those components work together in to create an experience. So
Mm.
I actually have seen a lot of teams doing this well, much more effectively, and thinking in sort of like, you know how do I offer some composability of things, and less about just configuring the heck out of a single component.
Let's say you're talking to someone who is maybe new to the idea,
Yeah.
and maybe not even a designer. Like, how do you typically explain what design system is?
Yeah, I would try to explain it in an example,
Hmm.
because like all the definitions that are out there that are short and succinct, they still leave a lot to the imagination. Um, I mean, there's people who have said things like it's agreement, like a design system
Mm.
is just agreement, like this is how we're going to work, which I think there's a lot to that as a concept. But it's a combination of assets, documentation, and processes that help us define how we design, build, and release digital interfaces. That's kind of how I think about it.
Mm.
And so assets are very tactical, right? These are things that I can pull into my Figma or into my code framework, whatever I'm using. These are tools. These are just all kinds of stuff that's very tangible and tactical that I use every day. And then there's documentation, which is really good definition of language around all of that. What do I call things? How do I use them? How do I actually use them properly?
Hmm.
And then there's process, which is how the humans work in and around all of that. So that's things like, how do we manage the governance of our system? What should go in it? What shouldn't? How do we prioritize? Like, how do we pick what to work on? There's all kinds of things. How do we deprecate things? How do we remove stuff from the system? So all of those things together, I think, give you a pretty good picture that this is more than just a product. It is actually a program that you have to sort of put into
Hmm.
place culturally in the organization.
Do you believe that there should be a dedicated team working on a design system, or is it acceptable for someone to like assume the role, so to speak, and maybe do, they're a product designer, but they're also, creating a design system? Like, I'm sure that
Yeah.
both exist, right? Like, we know that, at more mature organizations there's a dedicated design systems team, and probably if it's a startup, few people, like, they're unlikely to have a dedicated design system team, right? So it's almost like feels maybe a luxury. But so what's your take on that? Like, is it okay to combine and not be dedicated only to design system?
This is a tricky one to answer because
Mm.
I think I can think about this very, you know, at like a high level. When you just think about it, you would say to yourself, of course, we could have some folks who work on products, and just as they have 25% of their time, they should be able to take that work and make it more systematic. And if we did that across the org, we'd have plenty of time on paper dedicated to working on the system. But in reality, I haven't seen that work in more than one or two organizations. And I've talked with a lot of organizations about this. The one that I can think of right away was an organization that they they existed to manage open source software, and because of that cultural understanding of who they were, open source software is the idea that a community manages a thing. And so with that being so ingrained in their culture, I think it worked really well for them, because everybody sort of like, they believed in that as their ethos, and they were people who worked on other people's open source projects all the time in their free time, so that was just like who they were. But that is not the norm in most organizations. And so when companies think they're going to either one, build a system with a fully distributed team like that and no dedicated resources, or when they think we have a small dedicated team and we're going to get faster because we ask for contribution from these other teams, both of those are, I think, like tough. Those are real hard. I think there's a ton of value in working with product teams to help with the system, but it's not in efficiency for sure. That's like saying that it'll be faster for me to have my, middle schooler mow the grass, because then I won't have to mow it. But the truth is, my middle schooler needs a lot of help to mow the grass. Like I got to help him put the fuel in, and he doesn't quite know, he can't quite have the strength to start it. And then he's going to go kind of crooked, and we're going to have to go back and fix it. And so it's almost more work for me as a parent to have my middle schooler mow the yard. Now there's benefits though, too. Over time, my middle schooler learns that, oh, okay, I know how to do all these things. And then at some point in the future, it is beneficial, they're learning, they're gaining independence. I'm understanding what frustrates them as a human. They're understanding that I love them and that I'm patient with them and all of this. So there's like a whole other set of things that happen that are around engagement and empathy and like skill development for both of those parties. And I think the same happens with systems, right? So it's not going to be fast at first, especially, but we're going to learn a lot about each other. And I think that's maybe more valuable long-term than the little efficiency boost you think you're going to get. So, yeah.
So what should a new company, right? Let's take a startup, right? And they're starting out and they don't have huge financing. What should be their approach to thinking about a design system? Like take something out of the box that exists out there, just use. Which is interesting because you just mentioned, which is a very important thing, that design system is not about components, but right, like that's probably still the first thing that everybody thinks. Like, is there a way to break that mold? Like for example, right now I'm thinking like, okay, let's say the company doesn't have enough resources, but they believe that design system is important. How do they start? Or should they take something that is pre-existing? What are the things that maybe a startup, for example, should be thinking about and considering as they're beginning to develop their product?
Yeah, the startup example is a tough one. I'm very like, by default, I'm a very sort of systems thinking kind of person. So anytime I build anything, even if it's just my own little website, I'm always thinking about how do I make sure I'm creating little opportunities for reuse and efficiency in my workflow. But if you were telling me, I have X amount of money that I've been given, essentially, invested in me as a startup founder, and I have to find my market fit, and I have to prove that this product has value. I don't know that I don't think I would recommend that founder to go spend a bunch of that money building a dedicated design system team. I think you need to find individual contributors who are systems thinkers to also work on your product. And what's the reason is because you're going to have a small team. I mean, I would even maybe co-locate them. I know that's not the norm right now, but like if you want to get a lot of work done really fast, you put people in the same room and you're going to have like, it's tremendous what you can do. Right. So anyway, that aside, I would say, like until the product has found its real fit and can see a future that is valued, that's profitable, that is, whatever profitable means these days,
Hmm.
sustainable maybe is a better word. Then I think you could start to invest in a more dedicated team. But I think before that, of course, you're going to work systematically, right? You're going to codify some design decisions. You're going to make some tokens, things like that. But there's so many things that happen where you're changing the direction of the org. You're pivoting. You're just experimenting, right? So I think it's probably not the best example. But in a large organization where maybe you're building a new product, but you're an established organization, there's a market for this. It's a need you've already identified. That's maybe a different scenario. And there's a different set of challenges that come with that, where it's like, I have all these legacy products. How much do
Yeah.
I want my new product to be influenced by the look and feel of my legacy products?
Yeah,
Right. So
that is something I want to get into for sure. But like before we
yeah,
like so aside of creating a dedicated design team, which it sounds like, I mean, that is something that a more mature organization should consider, right? Now, is your typical recommendation for people to just kind of do whatever you want and just focus on like making that MVP and getting traction? Or should they still try to follow and like, maybe use something, some existing libraries, some existing styles, or like what do you typically recommend to like try
yeah.
to think it up front, or maybe just go with the flow and like don't even worry about it?
Yeah, if there's no, so we did a session on the question. It was called Inside Out versus Outside In, and
Hmm.
the whole idea was, if you were going to start from scratch with a system, what would you do? Would you start by thinking about the brand, and then thinking about guidelines, and then picking colors, and then picking typography and spacing and animation styles and code, write all of that documentation, and then
Hmm.
start to build all those pieces from the ground up, inside out? Or would you start by thinking about the user's experience, and crafting sort of a flow, and then design that flow, and then test that flow, and then take something that works and refactor it down into its smallest pieces and parts, and then use those to
Hmm.
construct more flows, right? I mean, this is a little bit of a trick question, right? It's not either or. It's the truth is, you need to do both. And so there's no way at the beginning of a product that doesn't exist yet, you're going to guess all of the colors you need. You're never going to guess the right typography. You need to see it in its use scenarios, So I think you have to start outside in, but very quickly you start refactoring. And then it's a process that kind of goes back and forth between these efforts. And so, you asked, should you use a third party thing? Like, there's a ton of really good, very robust systems, that exist. I can tell you, I own a studio called Sparkbox, and we do a lot of design system work for
Hmm.
big organizations. And one of the things that is common in our um, scenario is, many organizations come to us and they have tried to build their own design system based on a system like Material, or
Hmm.
some of the stuff that IBM offers with Carbon and things like this. And that gets them, a good portion of the way very quickly in the early days. But there's always a moment where it's like, it just doesn't feel like their organization. They
Yeah.
can't make it do the things they want it to do without some real extreme changes. Now, I'm not saying that you should never do that. I think there are times, and there are many products maybe that would benefit from that, and that would be a great start, and they're going to get a lot from that. But I think you just know that it's like a give and take, and it costs you something to do that. And if you're willing to sort of take that debt on, knowing you might have to repay it later, then that's okay, right? It's just a decision you make.
Yeah, in my experience as well, like typically with templates, it works great and very fast when whatever you want to do matches the template. And the moment you want to go beyond the template, then you run into all sorts of situations where it's like, oops, that is actually very complicated. Nope, you cannot have that. I've had different situations myself, especially back in the days, like when everything was just custom. Like the idea of design system was not even as like prominent, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? So it would be common, like, you start, you draw things, and then you build it, and like essentially, and there is there was less of understanding of what common patterns are, and like a lot, to
Yeah.
some extent, it was a fun time
Yeah.
to especially in certain domains where, like, when I was working like in biotech, like back in, like, 2009, I was starting, like nothing was defined. Like you can, like, there were no rules, more or less,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So then I've had experiences when we would take something out of the box. Like, for example, that was done on a project where the goal was to develop something as quickly as possible with, the least amount of time spent. The goal was not to do something outstanding, from the like visual perspective or something unique, and it worked, but felt generic. Um,
Yeah.
and then there's this other thing about, as you mentioned, legacy, right? And it's almost like whatever it is that you do, you create a product, and at some point, like, it does become, it already exists, it works, and it does become this legacy thing, right? And then you're faced with a question like, okay, what now? And then it's either you have a third party, system running under the hood, or maybe you have like a custom something running under the hood. Which situation is less painful? I don't know if it's possible to answer that.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, the challenge with legacy stuff in my mind, like there's nothing better in our world than legacy software. That means it's worked well for years. And at that point, it's probably profitable and, has paid back its, it's made its money, Um, but it does become when there's not space in the roadmap for refactoring and sort of maintaining, that's when it gets to become a challenge. And everybody's worked on those projects where, the code is sprawling and there's not a good understanding in the organization of how it's structured or why it is, even with the user experience side of things. And while it may be working, oftentimes it's very hard to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that could be because it's built on a third party framework or because it's custom or any of that. It's just that it's that scenario of over years, we just keep adding things and we don't do the work to sort of like refactor and rebuild, And so that's a tough situation. And, there's interesting places where you can like find the seams in those kinds of things. You can say like, hey, it's clear that we could replace the front end of this legacy thing with a new, there's a layer we can put in between that offers a little bit of an API, and we can replace the front end and create a different experience. But even that, you're sort of stuck based on what the stuff behind that seam can do for you, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a case by case basis, and it has as much to do with the culture of the organization as it does the technologies that were used, are
Have
they
you
willing
seen
to invest,
Have you
that
seen
kind of thing.
successful examples where a legacy product has transformed into something, up to date and like modern and beautiful?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We did some work with a really large e-commerce organization that had all this sort of legacy, custom ground up, stuff to sort of like track all inventory across like thousands of locations across different brands of stores, all of this,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of stuff. And like massive traffic on the front end, folks. And so they were transitioning. We were working with them to build a system while they transitioned away from some of that legacy stuff toward a more, you know, sort of like single page kind of,
Mm-hmm.
scenario with React and stuff. So um, it was, an interesting journey. It's a long journey. You have to, there are in those situations, there are always these two or three people who are like the ones who hold all of this understanding in their heads, and that in some ways is the risk. It's like if that person goes, we don't know how this stuff works. So the effort is oftentimes to just get as much of that out of their heads as you can and get it
Yeah.
rebuilt in a way that other people can use it and work with
Knowledge
it.
transfer, right? Like,
Yeah.
or actually, yeah, like knowledge transfer slash rebuilding. I mean,
Yeah.
where do you even start? Like, I mean, it's an interesting theme to explore. Like if we double click on that, like, what is the? How do you even make sense of the structure of such a project. You have legacy products, it's a complicated architecture, it's already, people are using it, there's already customers, there's commercial team, there's everything is already like, the plane is very much, flying.
Yeah.
And like, do you start with what, like with audit? Is that the first, or with strategy, goals, like the kind of the standard
Yeah.
stuff that you would think?
I mean, everything that we do starts with that stuff,
Hmm.
In fact, so we would go in and we would do interviews with individuals to try and understand, like, what are the pain points, where is this working well, who are the people with the knowledge. I'm always interested to understand the organization's culture, and we use the competing values framework, which is like a pretty well known sort of cultural assessment tool you
Hmm.
can use. So we do a lot of that cultural assessment, and we do that at the organization level. We do that at different sort of tiers in the hierarchy, like executives, directors, leads, ICs. We do that across disciplines to try and understand how does all of this play into the way decisions are made, and what are the norms and the behaviors of the org. Um, and then we also do very technical assessments, just like try to understand how things work. How does data flow through a system? Um, we understand, like, it's key to understand the money, like, where's the money coming from, how does the money flow in the org, all of that has to play into the
Why is it
priorities.
important
And
to understand the money?
I mean, you could look at the history of the last couple of years in the design system space to sort of see the pain that happens if you don't. Right? As systems teams, we didn't do a very good job connecting ourselves to revenue. We were
Mm.
removed from products that were generating revenue. And so when things got tight, the first thing to go was a lot of design system teams just got cut, or that people got taken, that this team got sort of dissolved into other product teams,
Hmm.
because someone up above is looking at a spreadsheet, right? And it's like, we make this much money and we have this many people on this product. Here's a team of design system practitioners, we're paying this much money, and there's no connection to revenue. So they're gone. I mean, it's like that, so we have to find better ways to do that, and I think the only way to do that is to understand how the money comes and goes. um, yeah.
What are some? I mean, this is a very interesting thing. So what are some of the ways of thinking about how design system positively impacts business? Like, for example, in my experience, it is, yeah. Like, I've had moments when it's kind of a little bit hard to promise, this, you know the dreamland, right? Like, it's not something that's going to start to bring you money in a month. Like, it's at least in my head, it's like, I mean, it's something that you need to invest in, you need to dedicate a bunch of time to, and then over time, there's going to be different types of benefits, like, yeah, in the cohesion of the experience and how fast the team can, produce, in the ease of onboarding new team members, things like
Yeah.
that, right? But is there anything else, to like, maybe some ways that you've discovered to kind of how to frame the benefits of design system to like executives?
Yeah, every executive cares about something different, I mean,
Hmm.
that's the way organizations are set up. They're intended to have, we have a VP of design, a VP of product, a VP of engineering, and these pillars are fighting for very different things. They're supposed to. It's that healthy friction that creates good choices, good decisions, good collaboration. So when we do this, part of the work is understanding what those individuals value. And some of them, it's going to be efficiency. Some of them, it's going to be the user's experience, and it's some
Hmm.
of them, it's going to be accessibility. It could be a hundred different things. And the good thing about systems, design systems, is that you can sort of like reframe the benefits of a design system to meet almost any need that one of these people has, anything they value. I feel like there are, just like there are layers of assets that we create, from like documentation to principles to tokens to components to patterns, there are also layers to the benefits. And you can think about it in the same way, where it's like, if I give you a set of components to use as a designer, you individually can get your work done a little bit quicker each day because you have some place to start. You're not staring at a blank canvas, when you get a new feature or whatever. So that's one like tiny level. You could also say, well, as a team, we can like get our work done collaboratively much quicker because we all have a same common foundation from which to pull. So there's like a team level of efficiency, and the product people are going to love that we can get to market faster than our competition, But organizationally and sort of culturally, if the biggest if inefficiency is actually not in just how long it takes me to make a button each time. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's in this other thing that's very really hard to track. It's like maybe you've had this experience where you get into a meeting, you're talking about a feature, and everybody kind of like leaves the meeting thinking they understand what we're going to work on, and they go work on it, and then they come back a week later, and people kind of went in different directions. They actually didn't understand each other, and so now we've lost a week. We've invested a lot of time over the course of a week working in different directions. We come back together, we're going to have to go redo all of that work. So we're 2 weeks behind,
Mm-hmm.
essentially at this point. And we're all frustrated, you
Yeah.
know, and it's all of that happens because we don't actually have a common understanding. We don't have a language to speak, and this is what systems do. They give us a language with which we can talk about all the problems we're trying to solve. And that's all design is, right? It's problem solving, So it's like, this level of efficiency that we get when we do this work well over time is like communication between each other in a way that lets us take shortcuts and actually get to the real meat of the problem solving much faster. So I think there's
How
like,
can, I mean,
yeah,
it sounds great,
yeah,
but I'm curious, like, uh, how can a design system help with that? Or maybe what is then the format? What does it like? I mean, you did mention earlier that design system is not just about components, but kind of like it also defines the processes and kind of how work gets done, which to some
yeah,
extent, I mean, there is other, you know, documents as well that sort of define how the work gets done. So it's there's probably like a certain area that is covered by the like how can design system help people to get on the same page, like in the context, like because to me that almost sounds like, well, maybe whoever was defining the goals of the project or the program, like maybe didn't do good enough of a
yeah,
job to like just frame what things are like. So where, how would
yeah.
design system like help with that?
I mean, you're totally right. Like, and the point you're making here is like all these scenarios where there's inefficiency could have been solved in other ways too. And if you think about it, like we've only been building actual design systems as a large community for, 10, 12 years, right? In the way that we
Mm-hmm,
think about
mm-hmm.
them now. Of course, before that, there were huge organizations that were building products and they were doing it efficiently. They were building cohesive experiences. So it's not like this is the only way to do it. It's just that I think this gives us something to kind of grab onto, and it's like the bringing together of these different ideas into one place. The system, the design system, the way I think they create some of those efficiencies, like the cultural, like the communication efficiencies, is by the process of writing documentation for all of these different layers of your system. It forces you to find alignment. If you go, I don't know if you've done this or not, just go try to name some tokens. Just go try to
Mm-hmm.
name your color tokens, right? That process, it takes a while, and it's not an easy thing to do because it exposes the differences in the way that we think. It's that same inefficiency in communication that's just intentionally exposed in the process of building the system. And so it forces us to come to alignment, to agreement on things. And that is like the real value, much more than having those things to work with later. It's because now we are coming at it from the same understanding.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You're talking about like expanding the scope of what design system is,
Yeah,
right?
100%.
And
Yeah.
almost like encompassing that it's, yeah, again, like it's not just about the components. It's about more things. And then, I mean, it sounds great. Um, do you then start to potentially get into like conflicts with other functions, and they're like, well, what are you guys doing here, like designers all of a sudden telling us how to do and how to ship? I mean, to some, I do like the idea of designers assuming more responsibility and contributing to the, to more areas, right? But there's also potential friction too, no?
There's a lot, yeah. And it's not just designers, right? Like I think every design system team should be cross-discipline, so it's not just a team of designers. There would be dedicated engineers there as well. I think they should have customer support people, because
Mm,
as soon as you have something that you've got a whole organization relying on as like a core piece of their design and development infrastructure, they're going to find issues. You need to support them. They have to feel like they like you're trustworthy. There's a whole other function there. There's communication. There's QA. I mean, all of the same functions that you need in your product space those responsibilities need to be covered plus some in your system program. But it is true that the work of design systems exposes all of the conflict. I mean, that is why it's valuable. You
mm-hmm,
either let that conflict either gets exposed in like really weird ways, in awkward meetings, in, like misunderstandings, or it gets exposed in a process where we say, hey, our goal is alignment. So let's just do this now. Let's get this stuff out. Let's talk about it. Let's work through it. Um, and then like the idea of components, I know we keep coming back to this, is like most people just think of systems as components. There's a lot of value in the assets, in the components, the tokens, all of
mm-hmm.
that stuff. The value there, though, is I think, in solving the very, very common parts of interface. So if
Mm-hmm.
I have a dozen products, then I could draw the Venn diagram of all these products, and the overlap of those is pretty small, right? Like the things that are common among all of them might be like
Mm-hmm.
a login screen, and there's going to be some core components that are like buttons everywhere, and I need
Yeah.
type, I need color, things like that. But that's a pretty small subset of the whole interface, the whole suite of interfaces that you offer across these 12 products. I think the assets of your system should focus on just that overlap, right? So, what are the things that are common among all of them? That's where we should be focused in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what we build and actually deliver to teams to use.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the stuff, all those unique experiences that are in a product's own domain, they have control over those things, but we have to give them the sort of decision making ability to make really good decisions that align with the rest of our products, and the system can help that. That's the cultural work that we have to do.
So should those kind of what you refer to as like more unique parts of the experience, should they not even be part of the design system? Like, or should it be kind of an ambition, or perhaps it's better to keep it out of that completely?
There's a lot of different ways to structure this. I think most leaders, when they catch on to the idea of a design system in their imagination, they think about a year from now when every component that every product needs is available in one library.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's realistic. That is like, you get into this work of like, you're just going to be building components forever,
Yeah.
like, and that's not a healthy place to be. The maintenance of that is untenable. It's many companies find themselves in that scenario. So I think we're in a season of design systems understanding they need to contract and reduce the number of components and focus on the common things, and give product teams some space to do the things that are unique to their product, but also encourage them to follow the design patterns of the system, right?
You mentioned a very important thing, like, that it's basically an unrealistic expectation to have every single thing in a design system, like in
Yeah.
have like 100%, adoption.
Yeah, that's not realistic. And I think so many companies go in with that assumption, and it's not
What
maintainable.
is a healthy ratio then? Like if we take, the product kind of as a whole, like what percentage of components from design system
There
should
isn't
it
one.
include?
I mean, I've tried to find that number. I don't think it exists, because like if I
It
have
depends
two
on a screen,
products,
right? Like if it's a login screen, then it's going to be 100%. If it's something that is very complicated or unique, it
I
may
mean,
have 10%.
yeah, if I have two products in my organization, the overlap of those products is likely, the size of that overlap is a lot higher probably than if I have 15 or 50 products, right? So if I'm trying to build a system that can support all of these products, I have to put my energy into the things that are common among them. And it's not that you wouldn't ever find a place where there's like 4 products have this need and 6 have this need. And that's the nuance of like, maturing a system into sort of interesting, unique scenarios where it's needed inside of an org. But I think if it's one use case in one product, that doesn't make any sense being in the system. Um, and so a lot of people use the rule of thumb of like, if there's 3 products that need this, or if there are 3 use cases,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's a time when we would start to say, okay, maybe that's a thing we bring into the system. Um, there's lots of ways to structure this too. A lot of organizations have these sort of playground spaces where
Yeah.
product teams can kind of like come and pull in stuff of the system, but then they can like mess with those and detach them intentionally and do some weird stuff. And other product teams are exposed to that too, and they get to see, oh, I see you're playing with this, we're thinking about that, and now all of a sudden there's this cross pollination, and that stuff is really valuable. And that can be a playground area where things solidify and get used in production, get validated, and then get brought back in to the system.
Would you say that, kind of talking about the size of a design system, and obviously it depends, but let's say if we take something like Material UI or Ant or um, whatever other one that there is, I mean, they're pretty comprehensive, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, let's put it, there is quite a lot of stuff in there. Now, am I actually right to say that there's quite a lot of stuff, or is it the basic minimum that is like, any design, like any serious design system should at least include as much as, Material UI, for example, or maybe actually like this more of a modern approach to a lighter design system. You know what? Actually, you don't need all of that stuff. Maybe you need like
Yeah.
20% of what like Material UI covers.
Yeah, I think it's probably more the latter. You
Mm-hmm.
know, Material UI, if you think about sort of its origins being like a system that Google's using for their products, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the intent behind some of now it's evolved into more than this, but
Yeah.
originally I think the intent was like, well, we need a system for our products. So how are Google's products going to look and feel?
Yeah.
Well, Google has a ton of products
Google,
and
if
they have
Google can run on it, yeah, like you probably don't need as much. Yeah.
yeah, so I think that the likely scenario is you probably don't need nearly that. Now, over time and as you grow and scale, will you sort of like fill in some of those gaps? Probably. Um, but it's so dependent on the needs of the organization, which is why it's hard for me to recommend by default just go pick something up off the shelf and use it. Like again, I'm not saying there aren't use cases where that's a valid approach, but I don't think that should be the default.
So it's sometimes you would say that sometimes it can be even like in the modern current day, it may make sense to actually start custom and not even adopt, or like, or are there modern like maybe, and feel free to like maybe even mention some specific frameworks like technologies kind of like that, maybe there is a way to almost combine, what we're gonna let us use, this library for this couple of things because it's already available and we like it, we're fine with this, maybe we're going to change the
Yeah.
colors on that, but also we're going to create a couple of our unique assets, and we're going to put it all together now and call it our system. Like it's
Yeah.
possible these days, right? Like to
every
combine.
company every company has like a different set of this is why it's so hard, because I can go to one organization and they may have like a completely different tech stack, even though the product is in the same space, the same vertical space as a competitor of theirs that's using absolutely different tooling, absolutely different engineering stacks. So like you can sort of make these things work
Hmm.
regardless of the tech, regardless of the tooling. I've been trying to help my coaching clients understand that a design system is like this weird sort of, it's an idea more than it is a thing. And it's like there's this sort of like very high level way of thinking that's really strategic about, it's less about what it is and it's more about how it works and how we agree that it will work. And in that world, the most common thing is the documentation for a component. Say if you're thinking at the component level, like we can write the documentation around, if we just use a button as an example, because it's what people always use, we can write the documentation around that. And then we can choose to implement that in any tool. I can build that in Figma. I could build that in PenPot. I could build that in Sketch. And those are all just assets, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the tools that we design with are going to come and go. And if all we do is build our system in a tool, and that is the extent of it, then when the tool changes, we're kind of in trouble, you know? So we have to sort of think at that higher level. Same thing with code. So I'm a fan of things like tokens, because there's tooling around tokens where I can essentially define them in text, in JSON, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then I can transform them to be used in basically any platform you want, right? If in iOS, in Android, in any, any like JavaScript framework, in
Mm-hmm.
CSS, like you can, that's an automation that you can run. And the same thing is possible with, even with like actual components, right? Using something like Stencil, I can essentially develop web components. And in the same way that you can transform, a slightly different, but in the same way that you can transform tokens conceptually, you can transform a component into a React component or an Angular component. So now I can build it in one place and then sort of like see it be used across different platforms,
Is Stencil like a designer's tool, or is it a developer tool, or
It's a
neither?
developer tool. Yeah.
Developer tool.
Yeah, it's essentially like a framework for building web components that allows you to kind of then wrap those components in the things that are needed to make them work in like a native React environment, not native like iOS
Mm.
native, just like a standard React workflow,
Mm-hmm.
or any other framework, like Vue or Angular, lots of them.
Curious, like technologically speaking, like kind of to my earlier question, like let's say if you wanted to use some assets from Material UI and then some assets from Ant, is it possible to combine different things like within your platform? Like, is there like a layer, technological layer that allows you to bring things together from multiple systems,
Sure.
and then also have
Yeah.
like your own custom components, for example?
Yeah, you can totally do that. I mean, the risk becomes like there's performance issues there, because like
Mm-hmm.
how, are you being really, really smart about only bringing in the things you need from each of these very robust frameworks? Or are you bringing all of that in and requiring all of that, to run your experience?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's performance issues. There's, of course, going to be like, collisions and stuff. And so like being smart about namespacing classes and stuff, things like that would be needed. Um, I mean, that's not what I see most organizations doing, if
Mm-hmm.
that's what you're asking,
Yeah. What
yeah.
is kind of the more of the, I'm trying to maybe like understand like a little bit more about like technological side of things, like kind of the
Yeah.
go-tos. And it sounds
Yeah.
like you're leaning on a side of actually like, the basics, so to speak, like more of the, create your own things, like don't depend on any other library. Am I kind of picking up on that?
I mean, I think for the long-term sustainability of
Mm-hmm.
an organization's systematic approach, I think that's where most companies end up,
Mm-hmm.
if they stick with it and do it long enough.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I'm trying to say that I think there are scenarios where it makes a lot of sense to use a third party something, and there are surgical ways to do what you were describing a moment ago. An example of that is, we worked with an organization they had a need for a very complex table that allowed you to display lots and lots of information and do sort of pivots and sorts and all this stuff, and there are like some really well built third party table components that you can
Mm-hmm.
just, one table thing, you just pull
Yeah.
it in and it kind of does everything.
Mm-hmm.
And the styling of it is limited, because
Mm-hmm.
you can only you can only push it so far visually. But if you can, in this organization, they're going to do the math on this. They're going to say, how long would it take us to build all of this functionality ourselves, and then we can make it look however we want, versus are we willing to sacrifice a little bit of the UI experience, or maybe shift the way we think about our workflow to work with whatever they have in this third party tables experience, to get a little bit of time back, or a lot of time back in this case, on the engineering side?
Mm-hmm.
It's like any other product decision, pros and cons, you got to weigh it out and you make a choice, and I think that's fine as long as you know what you're actually committing to,
Right.
and there's challenges on both sides, so yeah, and there's
So
no one solution.
yeah, so like we talked, and maybe we'll come back to it, but like we definitely talked quite a bit about, yeah, like the assets, components now, and clearly that's, as you mentioned, that's not everything about the design system. What are some of the other big chunks of, that people tend to maybe often overlook, even like kind of what are the right things to make sure to not forget about as you're thinking about design system? Like kind of if most people fall into this kind of trap of like, okay,
Yeah,
which button is going to be, what checkbox are we going to do? Like, okay,
yeah,
that's all great. What are the other things that should be discussed and thought about?
yeah. So I think there's sort of like three big categories in terms of like how to structure your work. What we've been talking about with components and tokens and all that, I would put under like the evolution of the system itself, right? Like evolving it, like maturing it, continuing to iterate
Mm-hmm.
on the assets. But there's also this aspect of education that's needed. In the question series that I run, one of the things that comes up all the time is the fact that people who are doing design systems work in a tool like Figma have to kind of get into Figma and understand how it works to build components in and to use things like auto layout and all this other stuff that product designers use a lot less. And so we may go build this Ferrari of a component, but we're also going to give it to a product designer that maybe doesn't actually understand how components work in Figma, right? They're used to driving a Honda, and so now all of a sudden we're putting this very
Yeah.
intricately architected thing in the hands of somebody who doesn't quite know how to use it. So
Mm-hmm.
is it the job of the design system team to teach a product designer how to use Figma in a way that lets them take advantage of the features of their components? That's a cultural question, like every organization is a little different. So there's this whole aspect, and that's one tiny example, right? Like that same
Mm-hmm.
thing exists in every little asset you release. So how much education should the team be doing? And if they're not doing it, who's doing it? So education is another big bucket. And then the third one I would say is engagement. And this is just like any other product. Hopefully, you would never go disappear, imagine that you know what it's like to be your users and
Mm-hmm.
build the perfect product for them and then release it without ever engaging with them to understand what they need, what are their problems, how do you actually solve them with a product. So the same thing is true with systems, and I think this maybe is even more so than the education side. The one that's left out is a lot of system teams just disappear and make a bunch of tokens, and then all of a sudden and it's not that they're not looking at the needs of product, but they're not talking to those people enough. And um, so I think bringing them into the fold, engaging with them to learn from them, as opposed to just coming to teach them
Yeah.
something, is a really healthy
So almost like
movement too.
thinking about that product team, engineering team are the customers essentially of
That's right.
the design system team, and
100%.
learn the pain points and learn your customer. Okay, so education, educate, evolve, engage. I don't
Yeah.
know if in which order, maybe.
Yeah, I wish it was as simple as do one, do the other, then do the third. But I think of it kind of as like a little
Yeah,
cycle,
yeah,
and you're like
yeah,
spiraling through those, just always
yeah.
doing them. I mean, this is too elementary to think about, but like in general, I try to look at anything that comes up on my plate in the design system space as like, okay, that's a thing I need to do. Is there education I have to do around that? Do I need to go engage with my customers? And then what's the actual work of evolving, to create it or whatever. So if you just sort of keep those things top of mind, it's a good set of questions to ask yourself as things
Hmm.
come up. And
Have you seen a situation when a design system team or designers started working on a design system with with the best of intentions, and they've done a bunch of work. They've created beautiful assets. They've created, I don't know, mock-ups using those assets, and everything looks brilliant and great. But then it's actually not part of the product, and
Yeah.
it never saw like the light of day. Like, have you ever seen those situations?
I mean, I would tell you, and I've heard other people in the space say this too, most companies are on their third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh attempt at this. And
Mm.
all the ones before it are scenarios kind of like to varying degrees, like you described. Now, that the idea that I've been given, 12 months to go design and build a perfect system and never once had pilots, never once engaged with those customers, never once started to get a little bit of something into the product. That's pretty rare, I would say. Um, but it's pretty easy to fall into the trap of, well, our system shouldn't be released until we have at least these 15 components, and I don't, I understand why people think that way, and I understand the tensions that are created when you work more iteratively, where
Hmm.
it's like, okay, we have a button. Let's just see if we can get some teams to use the button. um, it- you know, there's this thing I keep thinking about, which is like product owners not working on the system, but working on product stuff. They're kind of like the gatekeepers to adoption, right? Because it's like they're the ones who are setting the priorities for their engineers, for their designers, for their UX teams. They're the ones who are like helping kind of dictate the roadmap of the product. And if they're saying we don't have time for you to go rebuild the button using the new design system button, right? Like there's buttons already in the product, So it's
Yeah,
like some product owner has to make space in the roadmap for you to put a new button in,
yeah.
and that's not an easy thing to convince them to do,
In my
right?
experience overall, I mean, and I'm curious if that is common as well. I mean, one of the critical things is to figure out how to allocate resources, like development resources in particular, to the design system. Otherwise, you just end up doing, you can do a lot of Figma, and
Yeah.
that just, it just remains so.
Yeah. I think that's a really good observation. We just did once a quarter on the question, we do something called a design system consumer panel.
Hmm.
And so you just called the product folks the customers. The word that we use in systems is either subscribers or consumers of the system,
Hmm.
subscribers to or consumers of. So we do a design system consumer panel where we go out and we find people who don't work on systems, but whose job it is to
To use
use
them.
systems
Hmm.
all day long to build product. And we bring them in as a panel. And then I ask the community of design system practitioners, what questions do you want to ask of the consumers? And so we just did one, and it was actually with product owners who own a product and their product uses a system. So we had a panel of design system product manager or product owner consumers. So it's
Hmm.
very, very niche. But one of the things that kept coming up is this idea of like, what helps you as a product owner to encourage your team to use the system. And the thing that kept surfacing was this idea of developer experience. It's like if you make it really easy for the engineers to use the system,
Hmm.
you're thinking about their experience as a user of the system. If you prioritize that usability, it's much easier, because that means it's just like cutting back on the friction, the resistance they have to it.
Yeah. And
Um,
so, what are some of the ways to make that experience better? By the way, I really like it. I recently had a guest, and he mentioned he had a term, STX, stakeholder experience. It's something that
mm,
basically he introduced overall throughout the company, like for designers to just always think about not just your customer, like the end user, but the
Love that.
experience of whatever team you're interacting with, like sales,
Yeah,
product, engineers, regardless, like as a way to
yeah,
make sure that things actually get done eventually, like and
yeah.
just so it resonates as well. So like, what are some of the things that um, people can do, design system teams can do to make the lives of engineers easier
Yeah,
and increase that adoption?
really, really good question. And I think there's a lot of things. All of it starts with that engagement stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way that you might go do an observation of an end user of a product, I think it makes sense to do that with your developers. If you want to make a better experience for them, you need to understand their pain. Tactically, I think it ends up resulting in all kinds of things like you can build not just components for them to use, but you can understand what is their development environment like? What editor are they using? And can we help them create some little workflows that give you some really nice autocomplete, that give you like just in time kind of documentation in the place where you're working on, using that design system component. So there's stuff like that that's like tooling and like DevOps type
Mm-hmm.
stuff that's focused on the experience of that engineer in that moment. So it ends up getting into stuff like that. It's
Mm-hmm.
perhaps it's for designers. Maybe you're building Figma plugins that expose to them. Like I was talking with somebody who was building a little Figma plugin for their designers that on the back end had an AI, like an LLM kind of situation that was looking at it was trained on their guidelines for content.
Mm-hmm.
And it also was looking at a ton of example screens where really good content existed in the interface. So like microcopy. And then in the moment when a designer is creating a button or a drop down or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and they're trying to put the label in, they could click this button, which was a little thing in Figma, a custom Figma plugin, and it would
Mm-hmm.
make several recommendations to them for what the microcopy should be in that moment based on all this other stuff.
Okay.
And it's like, that's a designer experience thing that the system team is doing to like help the organization make much better decisions about really a really important thing, like what you put in those words makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
um, so it's
That's
stuff
cool.
like
Yeah,
that.
that's cool.
Yeah.
So basically, tooling, right? Okay, so tooling, making anything else?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, like even just the actual components that you choose to build, right? The way they're configurable, making it so that that is well understood and sort of like easy to understand. So there's all this stuff like in Figma that you can do with how these, the parameters of
Mm-hmm.
a specific component can be configured.
Variables. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Variables and variants and all of this, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you can create an
Yeah,
entire
variance.
experience for them in these side panels in Figma that lets you sort of like turn things on and off and show and hide and all of this. And so like the way that you construct that interface, that's how the component's built in Figma. So stuff like that. I think a lot of system teams by default they want to build like a doc site where all the documentation lives, but it's like maybe that's necessary, and there's some really cool integrations that you can do with things like Figma and things like Storybook to bring those into a doc site, but also not being afraid for that documentation to be in a place where maybe the more engineering stuff is a little bit more accessible to engineers in a certain place, where they're used to going for
Like where
docs.
GitHub or what?
Could be GitHub, could be in something like Storybook,
Mhm.
that's a little
So
bit
I was
more
going to
dev
ask about
focused.
Storybook. Like,
Yeah.
I'm considering like that's something that we've set on to utilize. And I mean, is it a good decision? Storybook, is it good product?
Yeah, it's great, and it's definitely growing. The sort of like way you can play with the interface in real time is really cool. If you hook up all the knobs and all that,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like in Figma, those
Mm-hmm.
variant adjustments that you can do. You can do that in Storybook. There's some built-in kind of like playground stuff like that I think is really really helpful for folks.
What would be an alternative to Storybook? Like, what are the top alternatives?
I mean, it's definitely the one that's kind of dominating that space. A lot of people build their own stuff, though, and I've seen teams using things, even like using tools like CodePen or that kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
like sort of standalone stuff to kind of like, hey, we've built all of our components and they're available here for you to play with, right? It's just like a different way of thinking about it. But Storybook's really built for this, and it's
Mm-hmm.
expanded beyond just working as it originally did with just React. So I think there's a lot of value there. And I think if you're going to jump into something like that, it's a very good place to start.
Okay. What about zero height? Like, how does it fit in? Is it instead of Storybook or in addition to?
Yeah, it's. I mean, this is there's like the tooling space in systems is blowing up.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really good tools, and Zero Height is one of those. And I think each of those tools sort of comes with an opinion. And I think Zero Height's origin story is one of like really good documentation. So if you want to create, like easily create a really good doc site that looks nice, that's consistent, that um, it has really good integrations with things like Figma or Storybook. You can literally bring those things right into your Zero
Mhm.
Height site. So I think there's a lot of benefit there.
Oh,
It
so you can
also,
bring Storybook into zero height.
yeah, most of those kinds of documentation driven platforms, I call those design system integration tools because they are all building all of these integrations with all the other tooling. It's a weird time, honestly, because I think a company like Figma would love to just own systems start to
Hmm.
finish, and you
Hmm.
see them making moves like developer mode and things like this that sort of
Yeah.
invite other disciplines
Code
into the
Connect
tooling.
or something.
Code Connect,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah. But I do think there's a space for these sort of like in the middle tools. There's others like Knapsack is another really cool tool. It's a little bit more about like prototyping than it is about documentation. So it's very much about integrating these things and giving sort of a new
Hmm.
workflow to teams. There's Supernova. Um, there's a bunch of these, right? And like some of them have things like token management built in. So
Hmm.
taking the sort of like source of truth for your token values out of a tool like Figma and putting it into a place where it's not like the domain of one discipline, um,
Yeah.
because if your tokens are owned and managed in Figma, then developers don't really feel like they can go in there and do that. If you store them in JSON files in GitHub, then designers are kind of like, I don't know, that's not my,
Hmm.
So maybe there's a place, in a tool like Supernova for you to like have a nice interface to manage tokens and the different tiers and layers of those and how they interact. And that's a common sort of accessible place for any discipline to kind of get in and start to use.
Supernova. Yeah, I haven't heard about that one. I'll check it out. What do you? I mean, we mentioned. You mentioned Figma, like in Code Connect and stuff. Like, does that stuff work? Like that whole like because there's. I mean, the idea that they're selling is like this seamless integration between your Figma and the code, and you push a button there and it updates. Like, does it stuff? Is it possible or not really?
We haven't really used it in
Mm-hmm.
that way, and like we've done some little experimentations, and they have some cool demos, but it's sort of like to me it feels a little bit fragile, and the insane variety of tooling that exists in real organizations makes it kind of hard to use that stuff. My impression is if you're going to do it, you have to kind of like use their very specific approach,
Yeah.
their very specific opinions on how this stuff should be done. There's a lot of convention in how things are named and all that stuff to get it to work the way that the demos show it works.
And that's an
um,
interesting thing, like about design systems. Like, and as you mentioned, like the space is super vibrant right now, which is great and super
yeah,
exciting. From like, I mean, I know some things about design system, definitely not as deeply as as you would, as you do. But so it feels to me a little bit like it's changing so rapidly that you almost don't know what to commit to. Sometimes, like
yeah,
for example, Storybook I've heard about for a while. I'm like, okay, like probably safe choice.
safe. Yeah,
But then some tools come up and you're like, hmm, I don't know, like sounds cool, but do I want to commit to it? Because then I'm tied to that, same as to, or even some conventions, right? About like even naming conventions and this, like somebody has this approach, another person has that approach, so it's a little bit of a wild west. Would you say so or not? Like it's kind of this
yeah,
vibrant time. Like how would you describe where design system practice is at the moment?
yeah. I mean, I think I generally agree with your assessment that it is vibrant, but also a lot of just it's in flux, and so that does make it hard. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that people ask me a lot in like coaching and consulting is, hey, I know you've worked with a lot of different contexts, like tell us what tools to
Yeah.
use, you know, like
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
point us in the right direction. And so, you know, my studio Sparkbox, you know, we have some things that have worked well for us and some things that have not, you know. And so, but that's just like a constantly changing and evolving list. And it's not that simple, you know. It's like there's so many constraints inside of an organization to know, like we're big on, like, I don't ever want us to be a company that goes in where with a hammer and everything looks like a nail, you know. So
Yeah.
I want to understand, what are the skill sets that you have on your teams? What frameworks are your engineers familiar with? You know, like we want to choose things that are sustainable for the organization. So it's always, there's always a process of evaluation, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And like some teams are totally okay with using Markdown to write content. Some teams need a CMS, you know,
Yeah.
like that's just a different approach, and you can solve the same problems. This is why I love to think about systems more as a concept. And all of these things that we're talking about, yeah, at this moment in time, you might choose to do this with Storybook. In
Mm-hmm.
2 years, you might need to move it to something else. But if you don't have the concept well thought out, that's going to be a really hard move, you know? So that abstraction of out of the tooling into sort of like documentation and like a really good set of guidelines and principles and a language that we can use will make it so that those transitions are much easier.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that to consider design systems successful, it has to be utilized in a product, like in a live product? Or do you think that there is a reality that, design system only, let's say that lives in Figma can still bring benefits?
Yeah. Um,
Like
I think that, yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
sorry to jump. Like my my personal opinion is like, because I've experienced cases when it was only like in Figma and it was never implemented, and it was very sad. And I'm like, now my current definition was like, look, it is a success. Like, obviously, I agree that not every single thing needs to be defined, but then if it's not used, I mean, what's the point? Now, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah. So this is something that I think we've kind of gotten wrong as as an industry. If you're just thinking of design system practitioners as their own practice, you know, their own industry, I think, and partly this is because of the fractured tooling we were just talking about. But right now, there's not a really good solution for tracking adoption.
Mm,
Right? We do things like we scrape the production code and we look to see how many of the components or how many of the pieces and parts that are building this interface have an origin in the design systems code repository, the component library we offer. And so then we get some number, you know, of like, okay, 50% of the components on this specific screen were built using the system. But the truth in that number is that is only an engineering number, right? Even if there is, if we just take a button, there's a button React component and there's also a button Figma component. Even if in production it's the React button, 100% vanilla React button, that doesn't mean that my designer used it in the design work they did,
hmm.
because some engineer could have just said, oh, that's a button, I'm just going to use the one we have. That also doesn't mean that the UX team used it in the prototypes that they did. That also doesn't mean that QA validated against that specific design system component, right?
Hmm.
Like there's all these other disciplines, and it's nearly impossible to track usage across every discipline, which is what I'm actually interested in, because I think your question is getting at something that's actually really important. If we only have Figma, we don't have any code assets in our system, well, that can still speed up the UX and design effort of a product. So is there a benefit? 100% there's a benefit, right? It's tangible. We can measure the
Yeah.
efficiency with which these teams work. Now, there's frustration that comes when I've designed it, I've built all of this complexity, and then it's just, who cares? It just gets rebuilt, you know?
Yeah.
So like that's hard. And I think the real value is in the language between disciplines, right? The space between things. That's where we get the real efficiencies. But you can get small efficiencies at the individual and the team level by having assets that support those. So I'd love to see us redefine what we mean by adoption. And it's not just, is it in production? It is,
Mm.
does every discipline throughout the entire product life cycle use something? And for that to be the case, the system team has to offer them something,
Yeah.
So
No, I think, yeah, I think you're right. I'm also going through this phase of like, well, yeah, if it's not in the product, it doesn't matter. Now I'm like, well, even if it's hard to get all the engineering resources assigned, and like I wish, much more would be in the product, technically we can still use design system to like accelerate our own design process and still make things more consistent. For our output, I think it's an interesting thing, kind of, yeah, like measuring effects of design system on different disciplines, because even if it makes it easier and faster to create rapid prototypes, for example. Technically, I mean,
yeah,
yeah, there is legitimate use in that.
absolutely. Yeah. Um, I totally agree with that. And I think there's also this concept of micro adoption, which I was kind of hinting at earlier, but it's like being okay with teams using like really low level things, like maybe and this comes with like this idea of what's the adoption roadmap like for a product team. So when I'm going to, as a product owner, if I want to come on board as a subscriber or consumer of the system, well, I can't just go from 0 to 100, like that's impossible. So what's the first step? you know and so maybe the first step is just look at the doc site and follow the guidelines, and that's a form of adoption, right?
Yeah.
Like we offered you the asset of our documentation and you're using it. Maybe the next step is start to use the color tokens. The next
Hmm.
step is maybe pick like three components, like core components. So I mean, like, I feel like there's a way to encourage adoption that gives product teams, lets them slowly build trust in the system and see that you're going to support them well when things don't work, and that you're willing to shift how things do work if there's a real need.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think there's a smart way to do it.
Yeah. It's something that I wanted to explore with you is, and you mentioned it in the very beginning, like about how sometimes teams feel like the design system itself adds some kind of friction, and people are a little bit concerned or afraid by like, well, you're taking away our freedom. I'll confess, I like to, in many cases, start with a blank slate without
Hmm.
actually looking at all of the predefined assets. And I know it's maybe controversial. I'm not sure. Like, this is, sometimes I feel like it's almost like a little bit maybe old school way of thinking. But like, to me, similar to how you can just take your notepad, and sketch something out. I feel that it's to some extent faster to set, like kind of almost digital sketch, because then later it will be translated, of course, to like components into the system. But at the initial stages, I feel like it is faster and gives me an opportunity to not focus on what's available and only
Yeah.
use those things, but actually seek the opportunities to create something that may fit that specific purpose, which is like, the goal is not to reinvent the drop down, obviously, or
Hmm.
text field. They will be used, but I do notice that oftentimes there are cases when you can explore and innovate, and if you kind of only look at it from the mindset like, well, this is your 55 assets, like pick and choose from them. I mean, it's possible, but something almost is missing. And so I don't know, I'm curious what your take on that is, like.
Uh, yeah, I think that's fine. Like, I have this idea that there are every individual is sort of like really fluent in one area.
Mhm.
I know we have people who are skilled across, but like, it sounds to me like you feel really confident innovating in a specific way, and that's totally okay. I think like what we want to see is if you're going to innovate, that's a decision that if you're on a product team, a product designer on a product team, if you have the time in your roadmap, in your schedule to do that, then do it. As a system person, I don't want to be policing your process or your way of designing product. When you show me that the innovation you made, that's an extension or a change away from the system, when you show me that it's working better for you and that it could work better for other product teams, then I'm like, okay, let's figure out if we have, we'll think about how do we incorporate that into the system so others get access to that great work that you did, like that's just how it has to happen. The design system team is not going to be the one out inventing new things. They're the team that's standardizing the innovation. So we have to make space for both of those things to happen. Yeah. And I do think system teams have gotten too far down the path of saying we're going to be out like evaluating your work and calling you out when it's not aligning and all that. And Dan Mall just had a little post he put out about saying like, hey, the team that does that kind of assessment should be separate from the system team, and I love that, because I think it's really hard to have the right posture if you're constantly out doing, evaluations of the product team's consistency,
Yeah.
Like underneath the covers, one other really quick thought here. Under the covers, yeah. I really do believe this is cultural work, and it's so much less about the assets, because if we have a culture that values consistent output for our customers, like interfaces that are really consistent, then all of the product teams will do that, right? Like if that's the way the culture is structured, if that's the set of values we have as an organization. If we don't, you're not going to get that just by giving everybody assets to use to create consistency, right?
Yeah.
So I can take any design system you give me and make awful shit with it.
Yeah.
Right. So the difference is I need to know, as an individual practitioner working on a product, how do I make 1,000 decisions today that align with the things we want our products to be? And the system team is just trying to take the things that are common there and give you an easy way to do that. But you still have to make the decision every moment, 1,000 times a day,
Yeah, and in the preparation for the call, for the conversation, I asked you, what are some of the contrarian opinions that you have, and you mentioned that the design system alone won't make the product more consistent. So, like, do you want to expand on that a little bit? Like, what are the other things that are important to make the product consistent?
Yeah, and I think that what I mean by that may be more because I have expanded my sort of thinking about what a system is, but I think the assets of a system are not going to make your product more consistent, right? And that's kind of the point I was trying to make, just a moment ago, which is like, I could take any system, and I've actually thought about doing this, about creating a little, little website that essentially lets you choose a design system that's public. And then I would make a terrible interface using their system, right? Mm-hmm. So we could take Material UI and we could make awful stuff with it.
Yeah.
And the whole point of this is not that that's a bad system. The whole point is, like, I still get to choose how I use the system. And so it's kind of like accessibility, where it's like we can build really accessible components, but if you don't think about how they're connected and how they work on a screen in a flow together, mm-hmm. that experience is not going to be accessible, So it's the same kind of thing. And so the things that we have to get to are like, what does the organization value? And what are the design principles at a very high level? And not just that, but like, how do those filter down into the norms and the behaviors? And how does that turn into a decision-making framework for me? And how do we figure out this idea that, like, we probably haven't grown by hiring perfectly aligned humans with our values? Mm-hmm. Like the truth is that that's not how most organizations grow, unfortunately. If we, in an ideal world, people that we hire to work on a product would perfectly align with the values of the organization and the skill sets that are needed for that. But that's almost never happens, So now we have a scenario where we've got a whole team of people that all have slightly different values, slightly different skill sets, and we're trying to get them to make something that's consistent, that sort of has the appearance of being made by one mind,
Yeah.
and that's culture. That is like an organization that is willing to say the to show you like visually and in everyday conversation what they value, and that all of that stuff aligns with what they actually believe underneath the covers. Like when things get hard, what decisions do they make, right? That alignment in the things that we've been saying to you for the last 3 years are now also being proven out when budgets are tight. That kind of alignment is the kind of culture where people actually get on board with the values of the org, and they understand how to make decisions that align.
Yeah, this
So
is beautiful.
yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about standardization and things, products, modern products, oftentimes looking and feeling very similar to each other,
Mhm.
and kind of how, and to some extent, one may think that, standardization that a design system brings, well, even standardizes it further, kind of making things even more, similar. Now, it's probably not true, right? So, like, what is the way that a brand can articulate their, tone of voice on, or their, unique voice, yeah, through the design system? Like, what are the tools that are available? I mean, obviously there is color. um I don't know, is it about the radius of the corner of a button, or like what are some of the what are some
Yeah,
of the ways that it can come across?
I love this topic. You're getting at this constant tension in design systems, which is I want like cohesion
Hmm.
in the end experience, but my product team wants flexibility, right? And it's like I can get cohesion to a certain extent by removing flexibility. you know, like if I give you only one color of button and
Yeah.
you're going to use it, you're only going to get the one color of button. So we can create cohesion by removing flexibility. But I think that does cultural damage, because that's saying I don't trust you to make good choices. So the ideal is we have a flexible system, and the culture creates the constraints that we need, right? So we make decisions that align. And a beautiful example of this, my friend Brian Alfaro,
Hmm.
he wrote this incredible post called Vernacular Design Systems. And he studied to be an architect. And there's this thing called vernacular architecture, which is like you can go look in like New England in the United States, and you can look and see how are the homes built, and then you can go look in like the Southwest and you can see how the homes are built there, and you can go all around the world and see the way that different cultures in different parts of the world create structures using the materials that they have on hand in that location. And that's the concept of like a vernacular architecture. We embrace the local material that we have.
Is it kind of like cooking with whatever is in season?
There you go. Same idea.
Okay. Okay.
And the same thing I think is true. This is the argument maybe against using something like material UI for your system, because you as an organization have your own raw materials to work with. And you need to build a system that uses the materials you have, the food that's in season for you. And if you're just taking somebody else's stuff and trying to transport it here, it's never going to feel quite like you. And so there's like an authenticity that comes with this approach of vernacular design systems, which is just like truly like you're not trying to reinvent things. You're looking through the organization to see how are we doing this well, and you're
Hmm.
codifying that. Then a lot of system teams start with what they call an interface audit. They go out and they look across all the products, and the classic screen, I think Brad Frost did this. He took a screenshot in a PowerPoint of like 40 different buttons, across his bank's website or whatever. And like, I mean, I understand Brad's intent. I love him. He's an amazing human, but I actually don't love starting like that. I would much rather you go out and do. It's a cheesy term, but I would look for look for delight. Go out
Mm-hmm.
and look across all your products and find the places where you're doing really cool stuff, and say, oh, let's take this and let's use this kind of approach in more places in the product, instead of saying, here's all the places where we screwed up. Now give us money so we can go fix it. It's like, maybe you need a little bit of both, right? But I would love to see us taking a little bit more of a positive spin on this, and like,
Mm.
just finding
So
great
almost
things.
like if there is more variability, kind of embracing it, kind of, and not like not trying to consolidate everything.
I mean, I don't think, we did it. We did do a session on the question where we talked about like this sort of like flexibility, like the variety, like what creates unique experiences and how can you do that with a system. And I think the things that kept coming up, it's less about variability and it's more about like embedding very intentional stuff into your system, um, so like timings in your animation, and like the
Mm-hmm.
space between things, and like there's all these sort of core design concepts. There's a really cool example. Lloyd's Bank in the UK
Mm-hmm.
just went through a big rebrand, and there's an amazing little video that shows how their logo is this horse. It's like a stallion,
Mm-hmm.
and so they kind of redesigned the stallion a little bit, but they did all these studies on the different, the sort of like timing of the motion of horses running at different speeds, trotting, galloping, whatever it's called when they rear up on their back legs, like
Mm-hmm.
all of these little movements, and they captured the timing and the distance with which they move, and um, and I think what's really cool about it is they try to capture that and encode it down into different types of animations that are now kind of being embedded in the animation system of their brand language.
Mm.
And so it's just like a way to say like, okay, who are we, right? This is vernacular. We're using the things that exist, our raw materials, and we're finding ways to sort of like embed those into the actual, uh,
Oh, I
you
see.
know,
So
interfaces.
they embedded the like the tempo of the
Yes,
of the horse, basically, of the movement into, and codified it as the system. I
yeah,
love that. Personally, I also like, I like to have, like, in a design work, like in product, like always some sort of a principle or a concept that enables to tie other things together. Um, like some sort of, it can be an idea, it can be a principle, it can be something, and then I feel that when you have those things, it helps to almost like guide and inform decisions. Like you have a principle, like what you just described with like the horse animation, and then so that, like, when you're working on interactions, like those are the principles that you're going to be using.
that's right.
So yeah, and it's almost like that allows to, I mean, that kind of helps to expand the definition of a design system further, right? Kind of to what you were describing. Like, it's not, again, not just components themselves, but kind of guiding principles of how the product is built technically can be part of the definition of the design system as well, right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And this is like that example kind of played out. You can kind of see some of their animations here, and down below you'll see like they're tracking like the speed of these different parts of the horse across a gallop, across a
Mm-hmm.
charge, across a flick. And you can see on the left side the movement of the horse, and on the right side how that's translated into animation inside of their actual design language, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this is just that idea of taking the stuff that makes us who we are and finding ways to embed it and incorporate it into the system.
I think it's beautiful. And I mean, plus that is, I mean, that is definitely what allows to help to sell sell the concept a lot easier as well. It's like not
Yeah,
only it results in something that looks great, feels great, but also just brings more substance, and like it makes things easier to explain and to actually make them live. Like, I'm sure that the executive team, when they saw it, was like, oh my god, this is so cool. Like, yeah,
right.
we love that, let's do that.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
they do such a good job of explaining why.
Hmm.
like, because you could make really cool animations that have nothing to do with a horse,
Yeah.
like people do it all the time. But there's like knowing that we took the time to sort of understand our own history and like do this work so that we had a justification for the timing in the animation. There's just something that's like people can get excited about that.
Yeah. No, this is beautiful. Do you see the connections between design system and say like architecture? Is that a theme?
Huge. Yeah, honestly, systems thinking exists in almost every place you look. You could look for it in the way countries are run. You could look for it in the way cities are organized. You can look for it in the way buildings are created. It is in the way a restaurant is run. Like, we are surrounded by systems. And so I've been on a really fun journey myself personally, just going back through reading. Like, I have, like, here's an example. This book is the Timeless Way of Building. I don't know if that's flipped for you or
Hmm.
not, but um, Christopher Alexander wrote this book. He also wrote The Pattern Language, which I think a lot of systems people know about, but less people know about this one. But this is so incredible because this book is him taking decades of architectural experience and basically boiling it down into like a way to think about how to create something that has life given to it by the things around it, the space within which you're building, the city, the culture. And it's like it's a beautiful book, and it's very, very sort of theoretical. It's like right up my alley. It's like this very high level thinking,
Yeah.
but it just really is inspirational. And Christopher Alexander was an architect. That was his thing. And so he's speaking about all this in the context of architecture, but it translates almost one to one into what we do with design systems. So I think that kind of connection exists everywhere. I'm reading another book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who was
Hmm.
a Native American botanist. Like, I mean, it's just like the analogies are incredible. And that stuff is
No,
everywhere.
I think, yeah, some of the, I know some amazing designers who are like former architects or like trained in
Mm.
architects. I think that's, yeah, I have huge respect to architects, and it's almost like sometimes unfortunate why they're being underpaid in comparison to all the digital
Yeah.
professions. But it's a different topic for a different day. But
Yeah.
yeah, like architecture is super solid. But to the point of like relations, like of kind of how one theme relates to another, I don't know. Maybe it's almost esoteric, but I often find that like I work quite a bit in like let's say healthcare or like biotech, life sciences, which I technically have no idea about. Like I'm not a domain expert by any means. And so one of the tools that I've discovered like fairly early on is the use of metaphors. And so like what I discovered is that when you are able to find a metaphor that maps to whatever it is that you're doing, somehow miraculously it actually maps and translates very well to a completely different domain, and
Yeah.
it actually helps you to decrease the cognitive load. Like it like you oftentimes find something completely out of a different thing, but somehow it maps, and then you're able to think through in that like simpler context, and
Yeah.
then it guides and informs you know a solution or a direction in that completely different domain. So there is this like interesting universal relationship between things. Yeah.
Yeah. That's beautiful. And I think at the root of that is that as humans, we're really good at seeing patterns in things.
Yeah.
And so if you can use an example of something that I understand to help me see the correlation to something I don't understand, my brain's going to pick up on that pattern and very quickly start mapping things. And so I think that's a really cool observation. And I think in the world of design systems, that is like a muscle that we have to flex,
Mm.
right? Connecting dots between things that maybe we didn't think about connecting. That's like the work of systems. So I love that that's a way you're already thinking about things, and I think that will serve you well as you venture into more design system work.
Yeah, no, I think our conversation helped me to really, I think of and start thinking of design system like broader. And I think that this is, I'm sensing that this is kind of where your work is focused now into like reshaping the scope of what design systems are. Um, and I think that that's beautiful. I think that kind of just starting to think about it outside of, yeah, like components and assets and just those basics things, and how can we codify patterns and maybe interaction models,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
like, because those are the things that product teams and designers do all the time. Like, one of the first things that I'm trying to figure out is like, what is the interaction pattern that I'm going to use? Now technically they can be yeah, they can be parts of design systems as well as like principles.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Look,
My
yeah, I
pleasure.
really enjoyed the conversation, Ben. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing. Well, like I think we covered a lot of ground.
We did.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I appreciate you inviting me, and you've asked some really interesting questions. You've kind of got me thinking differently in some areas too. And it's like when I think if you're just hanging out with people who think the same way as you can fall into the trap of just thinking that's right. But I like the idea of sort of being challenged to sort of express some of these things that I think I've been taking for granted for the last few months
mm.
because it's just normal for me. But like being challenged to sort of express them has really helped me kind of clarify some of my thinking. So thanks for that.
No, that's also. I'm actually curious. I don't know what was the top of mind thing that I asked that kind of made you um, think. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're, digging in on like the tooling and like how it
Mm,
actually, like the idea that we might take half of material and half of, shad cn and half of whatever else, and try to make them all like cram together. Like I just have never even really thought about the no, I don't know people who are doing that, but
mm,
there's technically not a reason that you can't do it. So now I'm starting to think like, okay, is there a world where we have all these systems and everything is really self-contained and I can start to like genuinely pick and choose and only pull the things that I really truly need from the best of breed. um, Now I think the risk in that is like, like this, some of these old system things. There's a guy, Russell Ackoff. Sorry, if we have another minute, I'll tell you a story.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Guy, there's a guy, Russell Ackoff. He's like a system thinker. He's like
Hmm.
classic systems thinking, and he does this kind of fun little story where he tells his students. You can watch the lecture online. I'll try to find the link for you. But he's like, what if we went and evaluated all the cars in the world and we pulled the best braking system out of one and we brought it in here and we found the best exhaust and the
Hmm.
best starter and the best, you know, whatever, suspension and ignition and all the systems and all the little pieces and parts, the best tires, the best seats. We bring them all here. We evaluate all those cars and we find the absolute best of each little part. And we bring them here. We have everything we need. In fact, we have the best of everything we need to make a car, but we don't actually have a car. And he's like, we can't even go get groceries, like, um, and he's like, the truth is the success of a system depends more on how the parts interact than it does on the quality of the parts themselves. And I think that is like a huge lesson for me, So it's not enough to just as a product person, we're focused on parts, we're focused on a feature that we're working on. Systems
Hmm.
people have to fight for the way that those features work across all products in an organization,
Hmm.
or at least that they support. So that's like two very extreme ends of a perspective and two very different skill sets and two very different ways of thinking, and we have to find the healthy tension between them. And that's how the best car, that's how the best products are made, So,
Yeah, this is beautiful. Yeah, I think, I mean, that's very, I mean, that's true, right? Like, I mean, having something that works is better than just a couple of components, or
yeah.
parts that may be top of the line engine, but yeah, without the wheels or without the whatever connects
Yeah.
the wheels to the engine. Um, kind of useless. Yeah, 100%. The reason, by the way, when I was asking about that example of like connecting different things together, because that's actually something that we were like looking into. And the reason I was looking into is trying to figure out how to actually merge the gap between like where we are currently as the legacy and moving towards something, updated. And like I was actually like having these
Mm,
discussions with engineers about like, okay, this is where we are today. We want to move there. Can those different things coexist? Because obviously you
yeah,
cannot like launch a whole new thing overnight.
right.
And like that is a topic in itself. Like I'm kind of still trying to figure out what is the practical way of transitioning from the current state, right, to the desired state, and how
Yeah,
to actually make it possible technologically.
yeah. That whole rollout strategy is a real pain point for systems, and that's where like that sort of adoption roadmap comes in, and like thinking, because it's not even just as simple as saying this product needs to move in this direction. It's like every individual working on that product has to change, so it is complex, and those roadmaps of adoption are very different and unique for each organization, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Ben, where can people learn more about you, and how can they reach out and learn more about what you and your practice does?
There's a lot of ways. My website is just bencallahan.com. And so from there, you can get to everything that you might want. My studio is Sparkbox, and there's a link right there to Sparkbox if you need like very tactical sort of help with your system. I also do coaching. It's sort of a combination of career coaching and design system coaching. I do that with individuals or with teams. And so you can get that information on my site as well. I do a lot of writing there. I speak at a lot of events. I'll be doing some online workshops and stuff with Smashing a little later this year. I also run that question session every other week. Folks can jump in. That is totally free to jump into. It is an incredible community. There's almost 900 design system practitioners there now, and we're just always learning from each other, riffing and meeting new people, and it's just great. And then if you're interested in that sort of on a more regular cadence, Redwoods, you can get to from my
Mhm.
site too, is inexpensive, but it's a very intentional group of people who want to just, not only do we want to learn, we want to synthesize the things we're learning and offer it back to the system community in some way. So I think it's going to be a really neat community as we get rolling. So
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for
yeah,
joining today. And yeah, hope to talk to you soon again as well. Yeah, thank you for your
likewise.
time.
Yeah. Cheers.